Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Tony Spilotro, the man who brought the streets of Chicago to the glittering lights of Las Vegas. Known for his sharp mind, bold moves, and unwavering loyalty, Spilotro lived in a world where opportunity and danger walked side by side. To some, he was a trusted enforcer and friend. To others, a symbol of how far ambition could reach when silence and power work together. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, close your eyes and imagine the neon glow of Las Vegas at night, the quiet whispers behind casino doors, and the empire of a man who balanced charm and danger with precision. Settle in and let the story of Tony Spilotro guide you into the night. He grew up in a tight Chicago neighborhood nicknamed The Patch, the kind of place where everyone knew where you'd been and who you'd walked with. His parents ran a little spot that served sandwiches and ice cream, a good place for neighbors to stop in, a place where talk drifted like steam from a cup. That corner shop put food on the table for 5 boys who learned early that you had to be tough without being loud. Anthony John Spilotro, born in 1938, was smaller than many kids, but carried himself like he'd never back up a step. The city was hard, the streets didn't give breaks, and he never asked for one. When he was in his mid-teens, he lost his father, and that changed the axis of his days. School loosened its hold on him. Money, respect, and quick decisions made more sense than textbooks in a home that suddenly needed help and a neighborhood where influence seemed to choose its own path. He fell in with boys who moved fast. One of them, Frank Colada, would become a lifelong shadow in the story. The two of them ran the early hustles you see in city files from that time. Shoplifting, small burglaries, hot cars drifting down alleys in the night. Arrests came. Juvenile court saw his name more than once, and police took note of a kid who didn't seem worried when metal doors slammed. By the late 1950 seconds, he had more than a reputation for teenage mischief. He had nerve. In that world, nerve got you noticed. Chicago in those years was a map of crews and territories. The outfit, as folks called it, had hands in businesses, both clean and not. It looked ordinary from the outside: restaurants, stores, truck yards. Yet behind those doors were decisions made by men who didn't issue press releases. Tony grew into a role in that undercurrent. He learned from older operators who knew how to collect debts without putting it into writing, how to quiet a problem, how to walk through a room, and let people know you were counting every moving part. He started as muscle on the low tiers, but moved up as bosses appreciated that he didn't chatter, didn't scare easy, and followed instructions even when they came without explanation. The 1960 seconds brought bigger stakes. Law enforcement began to attach his name to serious investigations, not just quick arrests. In the early part of that decade, he was charged in connection with the killing of a Chicago businessman named Leo Foreman, a case that brought headlines and courtrooms into focus. The charge didn't stick. The case fell apart. That would become a pattern: accusations, trials, and a knack for walking out the front door when verdicts were read. The authorities suspected him in other violence during those years as well. Reports and informants tied his name to acts that kept him on watch lists, though charges didn't always follow. He had the reputation of a man who handled problems decisively. Whether a case ended or not, his presence in files grew thicker. By the middle of that decade, he rose from an errand runner to a soldier trusted with collections and discipline. The outfit's old guard held the city. The next wave kept an eye on new money. His nickname, the one that followed him forever, came from elsewhere. Some say from FBI agents who wanted to get under his skin. Some say it rolled out of newsroom typewriters and stuck because it captured something about his quick, restless presence. He did not love the name, but it was never up to him. Chicago papers learned it, the public learned it, and from then on, even people who never met him knew that label. He married young. His wife Nancy kept a home while the city buzzed around them. He wasn't built for quiet domesticity, but he kept the family close. People in their circles saw a man who could be warm with loved ones and cold as concrete when business came first. That contrast sat at the center of his life. He tended to his mother, stayed connected to his brothers, followed traditions, then stepped out the door into jobs that had nothing to do with tradition at all. By the late 1960 seconds, law enforcement attention brought heat he did not enjoy. City police units with special names and federal squads watched his movements. Yet the pull of the desert was stronger. Chicago bosses wanted a man they could trust to watch operations in Las Vegas, a place flush with cash, crowd noise, and new risks. For years, Chicago had a pipeline to Nevada through loans, contacts, and business stakes in casinos that looked legitimate on paper, but leaked money off the books. The job needed someone feared enough to enforce the rules, smooth enough to blend into a showroom crowd, tough enough to make calls without asking for permission. He fit. In 1971, he arrived in Las Vegas. The skyline was still modest compared to what it would be in later decades, but the money moving through the count rooms already drew interest from more than tourists. He entered as the outfit's eyes and ears. The man who would stand between the bosses in the Midwest and the crews, making sure the flow stayed steady. Another figure, Frank Rosenthal, ran casino operations without an official title, an expert in odds, routines, and how the house won. One oversaw the floors and cash cages, the other oversaw compliance on the street. That balance worked because each man kept his own lane, at least early on. He stood out in that city of glitter because he didn't pretend to be a showman. He moved from casino lounges to back booths with the same calm. He introduced himself to pawn shop owners, pit bosses, dealers, and minor players who handled junkets and credit markers. He let it be known that the Midwest had a stake in certain houses. Skimming occurred in the shadows, money scooped before it became official revenue, packed quietly, sent out by trusted couriers. The idea wasn't new. The scale was. The casinos in question included properties later tied together under Argent Corporation, an ownership group fronted by Alan Glick, a businessman whose name appeared on the deeds, while others pulled the strings behind him. The exact division of roles behind those curtains would be the subject of investigations, indictments, and courtroom dramas for years. His job in that picture, according to prosecutors and witnesses who later turned, was to keep unapproved hands out of the stream, pressure those who hesitated, and hush the cracks before they widened. He didn't limit himself to casino corridors. He opened a jewelry business that became a meeting place and, according to later court testimony, a spot where stolen items could be moved without raising alarms. The Gold Rush jewelry store sat in a shopping area where tourists strolled, and it gave him a daytime address that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't look too hard. Friends from Chicago drifted into town. Some took jobs around casinos. Others handled errands and collections. One by one, a tight circle formed. The kind of outfit that could handle burglaries with precision and move goods as if they'd never been touched. Years later, people would call that circle the hole-in-the-wall gang for the way they entered targets without using doors. But at this stage, it was just another crew building a routine under the hot Vegas Sunday. He made allies. He made enemies. The Nevada Gaming Control Board never liked the way he operated in plain sight. In bars and on casino floors, he spoke to people who raised suspicions by even standing near him. His name landed on the state's black book, the list of people banned from casinos, a formal way of saying the town's regulators wanted him out of the gambling rooms. Still, he moved through the city as if his name weren't on paper at all. He had a way of showing up for dinner with a smile that didn't change even if someone at a nearby table swallowed hard. The desert has a way of amplifying choices. In the years after he arrived, law enforcement in Las Vegas increased its pressure. Federal agents from cities across the Midwest flew down. The Kansas City family, the Milwaukee crew, the Cleveland crowd, so many streams fed the money river that keeping them calm became a full-time job. He faced inquiries about loan sharking, about extortion, about burglaries that evaded alarm systems, about assaults that made some people change their travel plans. Prosecutors filed cases on tax matters, on conspiracies, on racketeering. Some charges died on the vine, some went to trial, and more than once he walked free. The files show how often his name appeared without being underlined by a conviction. Tension followed him home too. Rosenthal, the casino strategist, married a woman whose name would become famous in its own right. She moved in social circles where jewelry flashed, and gossip traveled faster than taxi lights. Tony and Rosenthal's wife grew close in a way that reporters later wrote about carefully but clearly. That relationship caused a split no one could ignore. In a world that prized trust and discretion, a personal rupture between the street enforcer and the operations brain made bosses uneasy. The heat from regulators, the noise from the street, and that private breach pulled at the same rope. Still, the two men tried to operate because the money machine still hummed, and both had reasons to keep it humming. As the late 1970 seconds approached, the crew around him grew bolder. Specialists arrived who could handle alarms, safes, and security patterns. Homes and businesses around town lost valuables without anyone catching a face on the night of the job. When police did trace a break-in to suspects, witnesses clammed up. He was still the man you didn't cross, at least not without checking who might be watching. His brother Michael took on a larger role and became a familiar figure in town. Together they kept close ties to Chicago while still bathing in Vegas light. He became the subject of more than gossip. A man named Jerry Listener, a low-level operator with loose lips, was killed in 1979. Years later, a former confidant would testify that Tony tied to that crime. Trials came and went. Defense lawyers tore into informants' motives. Juries weighed credibility versus history. One panel simply didn't believe the star witness beyond a reasonable doubt, and he walked on that case. That verdict didn't silence the buzz, though. It only raised the stakes for everyone around him. At night, he still turned up in lounges with the brass band and the smell of cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. He kept his temper under control in public, focused on business, but inside the circle, pressure mounted. The outfit wanted returns without headlines. The FBI wanted access without leaks. The state wanted to clean house without chasing away tourists. He stood in the middle of those competing desires with a past that kept catching up and a present that grew more crowded by the month. He counted friends carefully. He counted enemies carefully, too. Both lists were longer than they had been when he first drove into town. The morning of July 4 would become one of the most important days of his Nevada story, with a botched burglary that gave police the break they'd been waiting for and pushed key allies to switch sides. But before that set piece unfolded, the years had already built the trap cases stacked up, relationships frayed, and the regulator's patience wore down to threads. You could feel the sand shifting under his shoes long before anyone forced him to move. Fireworks promise celebration, but they also cover other sounds. In a city where the sky blooms red and gold every Independence Day, sirens blend with cheers, engines idle in shadow, and a few people stare at doors that won't be used. On one such night, a crew gathered with drills, glass cutters, and confidence built from a long run of successful jobs. They trusted their routine. They trusted the quiet. What they didn't know was that patience sat across the street with binoculars and radios, waiting for a signal no one in the crew could hear. That was Las Vegas at the turn of the new decade. Music at the front of the house, pressure in the back, and a man from Chicago trying to keep his grip on both. In the years leading to that night, the circle around him earned a name that stuck: the Hole in the Wall Gang. It wasn't a joke to the businesses they hit. They picked targets that seemed safe, places where alarms could be defeated and safes could be opened without headlines the next morning. The crew practiced methods learned over time, cutting through weak points, bypassing locks, entering not where cameras pointed but where no one expected. To people who studied crime patterns, the signature became familiar. To the public, the jobs felt like isolated mysteries. To investigators, dots kept connecting back to the same set of faces who met for breakfast, drove to industrial parks at dusk, and swapped out license plates before the sun went down. The man coordinating Las Vegas operations didn't climb through windows. He set rules, chose who got to work, and decided when to use force and when to walk away. He fronted a jewelry store that doubled as a social hub. Friends drifted in with stories about casinos and houses on the edges of town. People who trusted him could move merchandise with few questions asked. Police later argued in court that the shop allowed stolen goods to be laundered, a claim he denied. What's certain is that it gave him a daytime role that looked clean, while a different economy ran after hours. His younger brother Mike became more visible too, taking on chores around town and linking Vegas to Chicago when messages needed to move quietly. Law enforcement didn't sit idle. Nevada regulators had already placed his name on the state's excluded person list, known to everyone as the Black Book. Casinos were ordered to keep him out. The command didn't keep him off casino property entirely. He still showed up for dinners, met friends in lounges, and wore a smile that made some staff choose to look the other way. Federal agents from several cities started sharing notes. Wiretaps back in the Midwest picked up conversations about casino cash, owners who weren't really owners, and a Chicago loyalist in the desert who enforced decisions made many states away. Those tapes eventually fueled a broad case on casino skimming that would pull in leaders from Kansas City, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and the outfit in Chicago. Its code name Strawman would eventually appear in newspapers across the country. Inside Las Vegas, day-to-day power often came down to two men. Frank Rosenthal, the behind-the-scenes architect of casino operations, and the Chicago enforcer, ensuring that plans stayed on track. Rosenthal knew odds, surveillance, and the rhythm of a gaming floor. He arranged talent, tweaked lines at the sportsbook, and made sure count rooms ran exactly as instructed. The other man policed the streets. Credit collections, discipline for anyone tempted to skim from the skim, and one more thing that proved costly, an appetite for unrelated rackets that brought heat. From loan sharking to a rash of burglaries the city hadn't seen in years. All of that led to the 4th of July stakeout in 1981. Bertha's gifts and jewelry sat quiet behind a dark storefront, an attractive mark for thieves who liked to cut through walls. The crew did their usual surveillance. They chose the holiday because sirens would be busy and fireworks would hide noise. What they didn't know was that a tip had reached local detectives and federal agents. Unmarked cars took their places. The crew arrived with tools and confidence, the kind built after many clean getaways. Timing failed them. The first alarm triggered response faster than expected. Officers rushed in. In a scramble that killed the aura of invincibility, several of the gang landed in cuffs. Headlines followed. The leader behind the scenes wasn't on site and avoided arrest that night, but the bust cracked the halo that had protected the network. It also planted the seed of the most damaging turn in his Nevada chapter. One of those arrested was his old Chicago ally, Frank Collada. The two had known each other since teen years in the Patch. They'd run hustles as kids and graduated to bigger things together. In Las Vegas, Collada became the practical arm of the burglary crew. After the holiday bust, court dates lined up and bail was arranged, but the friendship had changed. By mid-1982, after a separate arrest tied to the 1,979 killing of a local operator named Jerry Lisner, Collada faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. He worried that he might be silenced before any trial, a fear that grew after rumors suggested he had become a liability. Under that pressure, he chose cooperation. He met with FBI agents, signed an agreement, and began telling prosecutors how the Las Vegas machine worked, from burglaries to extortion to violent acts carried out to protect revenue streams. Collada's testimony painted an unflattering picture of the man he once considered a friend. According to sworn statements, he said the Chicago enforcer ordered him to settle scores, including the Lisner killing. He described meetings at the jewelry store, cash drops, and rules for sharing profits from break-ins. He led agents to stash houses and identified accomplices. In court, the defense hammered his credibility, pointing out that he had cut a deal to save himself. The man at the center denied giving orders to kill or endorsing burglaries that fell outside the Midwest boss's interests. Lawyers emphasized that no fingerprints tied him to crime scenes, that prosecutors relied on witnesses with motives to lie, and that the state needed him to be guilty to justify years of surveillance. Trials related to these claims unfolded over time with mixed results, some leading to acquittals for associates, others resulting in pleas. He personally continued to beat certain charges, a habit that frustrated investigators who believed the testimony but couldn't always meet the standard of proof. While those courtrooms filled, the bigger casino story rolled on. The Argent Corporation, run publicly by businessman Alan Glick, controlled multiple casinos including the Stardust and the Fremont, parts of an empire that generated trust from tourists and concern from investigators. Glick later told federal authorities that he'd been pressured into business decisions and that behind his title stood figures from several Midwestern families. Teamsters' pension loans had financed purchases, and count rooms shaved cash off the top before numbers went to state auditors. The money moved in envelopes and suitcases along familiar routes, with couriers traveling out of Las Vegas to cities where mob families divided shares according to fragile agreements. Those arrangements held as long as everyone felt respected and quiet. Rosenthal held the center of that sensitive operation until regulators tightened the screws. Nevada's Gaming Control Board refused to grant him a gaming license, citing his associations and a thick file of concerns. He held unofficial roles anyway, a cat-and-mouse routine that irritated the state. The friction between Rosenthal and the Chicago enforcer grew at the same time, partly due to that private entanglement with Rosenthal's wife, Jerry. Personal betrayal inside a business that depended on absolute discretion shook alliances that had seemed unbreakable. The street man's visibility and the burglary crew's noisy fall added to Rosenthal's anger. In a line of work that prized low profiles, the situation felt reckless. In October 1982, a bomb tore through Rosenthal's car as he turned the key outside a Las Vegas restaurant. He survived, injured but alive, and left the city not long after. The attack drew national attention. Reporters swarmed the scene and cameras rolled from morning shows to the evening news. Investigators looked at a range of suspects without naming anyone in a formal charge. Rosenthal, in later interviews, hinted at betrayal but stopped short of pointing a finger in court. The blast became a symbol of how far the Vegas wars had gone, evidence that the fight for control had spilled into the open. Even without an arrest, the message echoed through gambling halls and back rooms. The era had shifted. Jerry's life unraveled as well. After leaving Las Vegas, she died of an overdose in 1982. The loss compounded the wreckage left by the blown-up car and the blown-up partnership. Gossip in town had always run faster than fact, but this time the facts alone were heavy enough. With Rosenthal gone, the casino machine stumbled. The state increased oversight. Federal prosecutors pushed their strawman indictments forward. Midwestern bosses watched two things at once: their longtime relationships on the Strip coming apart, and their Las Vegas representative pulling attention from every direction. Through this period, the man from Chicago faced a stack of legal problems. Federal grand juries named him in racketeering cases, some counts tied directly to casino skimming. Others involved extortion, interstate travel for illicit purposes, and conspiracies connected to the burglary crew. He posted bond, met with lawyers, and kept appearing in public, a show of defiance that played well to some and looked reckless to others. He could still be charming at a restaurant table, the kind of person who remembered a waiter's name from a year ago and tipped big. He could also shut down a conversation with a stare that signaled the end of a request or the end of a relationship. Friends noticed the shift. So did enemies. The list of both kept changing. Inside the outfit, patience thinned. Older bosses wanted quiet profits and lower profiles. They didn't appreciate the arrests in Vegas, the newspaper photos, or the open feud with Rosenthal. They cared about the returns from the count rooms and didn't care for distractions caused by burglary crews that didn't enrich the people back home. At meetings in the Midwest, messengers carried warnings. Keep a lid on things. Keep crews in line. Bring money with less noise. The man in the desert promised to comply, yet events kept outrunning those promises. Police called press conferences. Prosecutors leaked that star witnesses were rehearsing for trials. The public, drawn by glamour, got a look at something colder. The botched job at Bertha's kept paying dividends for law enforcement. Evidence recovered at the scene led to weapons, vehicles, and apartments used by the crew. Phone records mapped social circles. Under questioning, lesser players talked to save themselves. Collada's cooperation unlocked stories that only an insider could tell. He walked agents through walkthroughs, pointed out features in the jewelry store, and showed where goods were moved after successful burglaries. He described an extortion routine that targeted gamblers and small business owners who fell behind on debts. Each revelation fed ongoing cases in Clark County and fed indictments as far away as Kansas City. Even with all of that, the enforcer remained a difficult target. He had cultivated the habit of avoiding phones, rarely signed anything, and kept a small circle for sensitive talks. When the state tried to keep him out of casinos, he switched to restaurants. When his name appeared on an indictment, he turned up in court in a neat suit, shook hands with a bailiff he'd met years before, and stared past cameras as if they weren't there. For every leak from a witness who flipped, his side countered with credibility attacks. They highlighted inconsistencies, deals cut to avoid prison, and motives to lie about a man who symbolized the Vegas mob. Juries listened, and more than once the result favored him. Still, he couldn't reverse the larger current. Strawman pulled in major figures. Wiretaps captured phone calls in which Midwestern bosses discussed the skim in clinical tones, the way legitimate executives talk about inventory. Those recordings, along with testimony from casino insiders and businessmen like Glick, gave prosecutors the spine of a case that finally landed convictions. Some top bosses received heavy sentences, proof that the government could reach into rooms that had felt untouchable for decades. The man in Las Vegas sat outside some of those convictions, continuing to insist he was a businessman hounded because of who he knew. Prosecutors called him an enforcer who ran side hustles and punished disloyalty. The truth of his influence was visible even when paper trails weren't. At home, his world swung between family dinners and late-night calls. He doted on his son, visited his mother when he returned to Chicago, and kept close to his brothers, especially Mike. Those were the anchors he touched, even as a federal case file grew thicker by the month. He liked the routine of certain diners, the smell of coffee at dawn, and the way sunrise looked from a parking lot after a long night of keeping score. In quiet moments, he could joke, tell a story about schoolyard days in the patch, or talk about his father's shop as if it were yesterday. Then the phone would buzz, and the other life would rush back in. By the early 1980 seconds, Las Vegas no longer looked like the place he'd entered a decade earlier. The city grew taller. Hotels rose with corporate money rather than loans from union funds. Oversight sharpened. Gaming regulators felt empowered, and casino executives didn't want the baggage that came with shadow owners. The desert that once hid secrets seemed to spit them out. Within the outfit, the question shifted from how to fix Vegas to whether Vegas had become a liability. For a man who had built a reputation on control, each headline felt like a slipped grip. The tension set the stage for what came next. He had mounting legal trouble, a tower of accusations built on the word of former allies, a broken alliance with the man who ran casino operations, and bosses who were tired of surprises. Even so, he kept moving between towns, shaking hands in Chicago, checking on business in Las Vegas, making promises that sounded calm while storms built across state lines. He'd survived trials, survived decades in a dangerous business, and believed he could ride out one more wave. People around him weren't so sure. Some advised him to pull back. Others stopped taking his calls. A few began to wonder how the story could possibly end without another explosion, in court or in the street. Through it all, the facts of his life remained stark. A Chicago upbringing that favored toughness. A rise through the outfit based on nerve and reliability. A move to Nevada to protect a river of money. A side world of burglaries that proved costly. And a string of legal battles that left him bruised but still on his feet. Agents watched. Prosecutors planned. Old friends weighed loyalty against survival. Las Vegas changed course. The Midwest measured losses. The clock ticked. He could read a room the way a card counter watches a shoe, keeping track of what had gone by and what might come next. In the early 80s, the count turned bad. Casinos evolved from privately steered properties to corporate showcases with investor calls and compliance officers. The town he'd helped control now had boardrooms, audits, surveillance directors who saw everything, and a state that felt newly confident. He still had a table at favorite restaurants, still got nods from old-time pit bosses, still dressed neat, and kept his voice even. Yet, something essential had shifted. The pipeline that ran from count rooms to Midwestern back offices, quiet for so long now, howled with subpoenas and wiretap transcripts. He could hold a stare, but he couldn't stop an era from closing. The federal push came in layers. Agents had bugged offices and lounges far from Nevada, catching fragments of plans and after-action reports about casino skimming, collections, and discipline. Those tapes later formed the backbone of a case that stunned people who assumed the chain between Las Vegas and the Midwest would hold forever. Meanwhile, local detectives in Clark County followed burglaries that carried a distinct imprint. The July stakeout that ended with arrests broke the spell of invincibility, and the choice made by his boyhood friend, after that switching sides, changed the geometry of every conversation. It's one thing to fight a case built on ledgers. It's another to meet a witness who can say where a meeting took place, who sat where, who used which word, and why a decision was made. That witness laid out stories that stretched back to Chicago, before Nevada ever heard his name. He described how discipline worked in the 60s, when the outfit policed its own with consequences that kept younger crews in line. Some incidents had always hung in rumor. 2 associates found dead after breaking rules in 1960. 2. A feared loan shark slain in 1973. A businessman beaten and shot in an earlier decade. None of those incidents ended with him convicted in a courtroom. Prosecutors, however, used the recollections to paint a picture of a man trusted to settle disputes, collect debts, and keep a boundary around who could earn. When defense lawyers pushed back, they stressed that old stories are easy to embellish and that witnesses with deals will say what they must to survive. The judge reminded jurors that allegations are not verdicts. Still, the portrait reached the public. It had power even when it couldn't satisfy the strict rules of proof. The Las Vegas chapter stayed louder because it had visible business as its backdrop. In that city, he served as the fixer for bosses who expected results without headlines. The arrangement through Argent Corporation kept the money moving for a time. It depended on count rooms working with metronomic precision, on owners who signed paperwork without asking too many questions, and on everyone in the chain respecting boundaries that gave each family a share. As regulatory pressure rose, the plan became harder to maintain. Hotel towers kept opening, so did case files. Nevada regulators added teeth to the black book. Being listed meant casino floors could eject someone without a hint of drama, a public stamp that forced him to do more of his business in parking lots and coffee shops instead of baccarat pits. The dynamic with Frank Rosenthal couldn't be mended. One ran gambling floors with an obsessive eye. The other enforced quiet on streets and in back offices. They had once looked like complementary halves of a single machine. The romance with Rosenthal's wife cut that bond beyond repair. That personal rift mattered as much as any indictment, because trust had been the currency that kept cameras from catching more than smiles. Now both men carried separate circles, separate resentments, and separate risks. The bombing that Rosenthal survived turned those tensions into national news. No court ever pinned that act on him, yet the very possibility hardened opinions in law enforcement and the press. He wanted to run operations. Everyone else now saw a symbol. Next came the big cases. Federal prosecutors packaged casino, skimming into charges that crossed state lines and connected names in Las Vegas to dining rooms in Kansas City and conference rooms in Milwaukee and Cleveland. Testimony from businessmen who once wore the public face of casino ownership described quiet meetings where they felt pressed to comply. Teamsters loans, easy when approved and impossible to ignore afterward, funded purchases that paid dividends off the books. Couriers traveled with cash to out-of-state bosses who recorded nothing and expected no trouble. When indictments rolled out, they carried lists of counts that connected bribery, fraud, and racketeering across half the map. In court, jurors listened to hours of tapes in which men talked about the skim like they were reviewing inventory. Convictions followed for figures higher up the chart. Some went to prison for long terms. The Las Vegas fixer watched those outcomes with a face that gave little away, aware that every guilty verdict elsewhere made his own margin thinner at home. On the ground, his own docket filled. He faced state charges tied to the burglary crew and federal accusations that he ran a criminal enterprise. Prosecutors leaned on cooperating witnesses to describe extortion and loan operations, including interest rates that ensured a debtor never truly escaped. They told jurors about gamblers who borrowed at desperate moments and later felt pressure in the form of unannounced visits and threats that never had to be spoken twice. They outlined protection fees for small businesses that didn't ask for guardians but learned to pay on time. They drew lines from the gold rush jewelry counter to storage lockers and apartments where merchandise moved after break-ins. The defense countered with the basics: no fingerprints, no recordings of him ordering crimes, a clean record of licenses and tax filings for the storefront, and a pattern of prosecutors leaning on career criminals to build a narrative. Some jurors agreed. Some didn't. Not every case reached a verdict before fate intervened. His circle thinned. Some associates left town. Others took plea deals. A few went quiet and hoped to be forgotten. One loyal figure, Herbert Blitzstein, kept the day-to-day running when the boss traveled. Blitzstein had a knack for books and for smoothing disputes among earners, a useful skill when tempers ran hot. The younger brother, Mike, stayed physically close, a reminder of family in a world without many guarantees. The two had always been tight, as kids in the patch, and later as adults living out west among casinos and cul-de-sacs. Their bond would matter when decisions made in Chicago began to eclipse everything else. Back home, leaders saw Las Vegas as a ledger item that once brought steady returns and now delivered subpoenas. Powerful names, men who had spent decades avoiding cameras, found themselves on the wrong end of federal verdicts. They looked for reasons. They blamed gossip, aggressive agents, new laws, and the desert crew's appetite for side hustles that created avoidable heat. They disliked the affair that had made a private problem into public entertainment. They disliked photographs of their representative walking out of court with reporters crowding around. Most of all, they disliked risk they couldn't control. Messages traveled by trusted mouths: keep your head down. Cut the extras. Focus only on what benefits the house. Whether those instructions were ignored or overtaken by events didn't change the perception that things under him had gotten noisy. Nevada, meanwhile, accelerated into a modern era. Casinos installed advanced surveillance and turned regulatory meetings into standard procedure rather than theater. Executives learned to trace every dollar. The kind of relationship that once allowed an insider to dictate policies without holding an official title faded away. He could still pull favors, but he no longer shaped the town. That loss was personal. He had stepped off a plane in 1971 as the man who would keep the river straight. The river had been dammed, rerouted, and eventually wired with sensors. He could stand in a showroom and remember the days when 3 handshakes settled everything. Now a handshake bought you a cup of coffee and a reminder that the state had someone in every count room. The legal fights kept piling up, on top of state cases tied to the burglary crew. A federal racketeering indictment accused him of running a Vegas enterprise that reached from loans to extortion to occasional violence used as warning. He met bond conditions and traveled. He showed up at hearings pressed and polite, never raising his voice, letting lawyers argue while he watched jurors the way a veteran gambler watches a dealer who has changed rhythm. He kept a routine on the outside, a short list of restaurants, a walk through a retail plaza where he knew the security guards, late-night calls from payphones that he trusted more than landlines. Friends from high school days marveled that his manner never changed. He'd ask about their kids, tell a quick story about an old teacher, then take a call and walk away mid-sentence like a man stepping through a door no one else could see. There were efforts to patch relations with the Midwest. He traveled back for conversations meant to calm leaders who worried about what he might do next. He promised smaller footprints and better results. Whether those meetings soothed anyone is unclear. Behind the courtesy sat wounded pride, lost revenues, and a city whose press ran his photo whenever organized crime came up. The younger brother encouraged calm, pointed out that trials were pending, and that it made no sense to force new drama. They both knew how these disagreements could end when patience ran out. That knowledge hung in the air each time they parked outside a restaurant with a back room. Stories about his early years circulated again as trials elsewhere reopened old cases. Journalists wrote about rumors that had shadowed him since his 20s. That he handled enforcement on the city's northwest side. That he beat certain cases because witnesses changed their minds. That his cool temper hid a capacity to make problems vanish. Attorneys reminded anyone who asked that allegations from the 60s are not the same as proofs in the 80s. Still, when a former insider like Culotta took the stand and spoke about killings, burglaries, and shakedowns, those lines grew blurry for readers far from the courtroom. The gap between what could be proven and what people believed widened, usually to his disadvantage. At home, he kept close to his family. He stood up for relatives at gatherings, brought gifts, and tried to keep everyday life insulated from headlines. He'd show up at a niece's birthday with a quiet smile, tug a brother into the kitchen to trade memories about their father's candy store, and step back out into a night where unmarked sedans followed 2 cars behind. That split life worked for a while. It relied on mental compartments: this is family, this is business, this is noise I can't control. As indictments multiplied and old allies disappeared into witness rooms, those compartments began to leak. In Las Vegas, he lost ground brick by brick. The jewelry store was raided, inventory seized, and accounting scrutinized line by line. Associates took plea bargains that included testimony against him. Judges issued orders that limited where he could go. News anchors learned to say his name without stumbles and treated his appearances like weather events. They might not change the day, but everyone would hear about them. He denied involvement in acts described by former friends and insisted that he had become a stand-in for every unsolved crime in the desert. Some listeners believed him. Others decided the specifics barely mattered. The general idea fit their sense of the story. By 1985, the Circle in Chicago had concluded that Las Vegas, as they knew it, was over. Corporate owners wanted clean books, and distance from the past. Young bosses saw more safety in video poker routes and real estate than invisible stakes at neon palaces. The older generation men who remembered when a phone call could clear clouded skies felt betrayed by time. The question became not whether to keep the old system alive, but what to do about the man who had represented it in the West. Signals moved through the network as they always had, in careful phrases over short calls and quiet remarks in doorways. A meeting would be needed, they said. A sit-down to resolve everything at once. In the months that followed, he moved between cities often. He met with attorneys over active cases and sketched defense strategies with familiar confidence. He ate with relatives and promised that better days would return after the courts. He checked on old contacts, those who still answered, and asked whether any fresh rumors needed attention. He tamped down freelancers who tried to use his name for their own leverage. He repeated to anyone who suggested a retreat that he'd never run. It wasn't bravado so much as a creed. The boy from the patch had decided long ago that he would face what came. He had made it through raids, arraignments, and betrayals. He figured he could make it through this. The calendar moved toward summer, and his court dates clustered. Defense lawyers kept filing motions. Prosecutors refined witness lists. Reporters worked sources, looking for the next development. In quiet corners of Chicago, decisions about his fate in the organization hardened. People who had once toasted him now spoke about him in sentences that ended with periods rather than commas. He still took calls from the old neighborhood, and still trusted the power of a handshake completed in a back room. Yet the rooms he entered no longer belonged to his era. He didn't know it with certainty, but the next door he walked through in Illinois would mark a turn that no lawyer could fix and no desert charm could delay. The man who had kept his balance through 2 decades of pressure stood on the edge of a choice made by others. Men who believed the way forward required cutting ties with a past that brought too much heat. The city where he learned to read faces would present him with a room full of familiar ones, and the story that began in a candy store would move toward its hardest chapter. A meeting meant to fix everything rarely fixes anything. In his world, a summons back to Chicago carried history, obligation, and risk. He had spent months trying to calm tempers, promising that the noise from Las Vegas would quiet, that the courtroom pressure could be managed, that the lines of money still existed even if the city had changed shape. He arrived to talk, to reassure, to show he still respected the chain that ran from neighborhood storefronts to corner booths, where decisions were made by a nod. The calendar said 1986. Time said the era had turned. He had just walked out of a Las Vegas courtroom with a win that surprised many watchers. A jury had listened to a key witness, his one-time friend, who flipped and decided the state hadn't met its burden in the killing of Jerry Lisner. The acquittal, delivered that spring, looked like a comeback to people who measured his life in verdicts. It didn't change the mood back home. Leaders saw the broader problem. Indictments had landed on heavy names over casino skimming. Nevada regulators acted with new energy, and the Las Vegas crew had drawn far too much attention with side jobs and public feuds. Victories in court didn't repair trust. They didn't erase headlines or soften the sting of a wounded pipeline. Those leaders had their own battles. In the Midwest, a chain of convictions tied to the skim cut deep. Wiretaps and testimony put respected bosses on the losing side of federal cases. The prison sentences that followed felt personal. Old-timers, men who had negotiated peace for decades, now saw photos of themselves in handcuffs on front pages. They wanted quiet returns, not a desert loud with sirens and microphones. They blamed the spotlight on the man who had been sent to guard their interests out west. They also blamed the distractions, loan collections that spilled into violence, the burglary crew that ended with a holiday raid, and the social mess with Frank Rosenthal's wife that made Las Vegas feel unmanageable. In private rooms, they spoke plainly. The West had to stop bleeding risk. He moved through Chicago that summer, like someone visiting an earlier chapter, seeing cousins, hugging his mother, catching up with familiar faces in restaurants that still served the same baked dishes he'd loved as a kid. He kept a tight schedule of lawyer meetings because his legal troubles hadn't vanished. RICO counts remained in play. Cases tied to extortion and loan operations still sat on calendars. He wore the same neat suits, offered the same small smiles, and carried himself with the calm that had helped him through decades of hard moments. His brother Mike stayed close. The two had been a tandem from the beginning, older brother steadying younger, younger brother giving older a buffer of family. Mike had tried to straddle two worlds, chasing small parts in films while helping with errands in Las Vegas. He wasn't built for the fever pitch of the street, but loyalty is its own gravity. The call came about a meeting to settle disputes. In their culture, such invitations felt routine yet serious. You went. You made your case. You left with a plan. He'd done it before. This time, he and Mike headed out together. They didn't expect finality. They expected old rules to hold. Speak without raising your voice. Show respect. Address grievances. Take responsibility for what can be repaired. The brothers told family they were stepping out. Hours passed. They didn't return. A search began without press releases. People who loved them called quiet contacts. The city noticed in that way cities do hushed conversations in coffee shops, longer pauses at traffic lights, the feeling that a chapter had closed before anyone would admit it. Days later, workers in rural Indiana found two bodies in a field. The state police called Chicago detectives. Identifications followed. The official explanation avoided drama. The unofficial one traveled fast. The brothers had been taken off the board by the same organization that once relied on the older one to solve its problems. Reporters tied the deaths to everything that had come before. The pressures around casino cash, the 1,980, one burglary fiasco that cracked the mystique, the bomb that injured Rosenthal, the affair that used to be whispered about and now sat out in the open, the steady stream of legal risk that had marched from Las Vegas into federal courtrooms across the country. Friends of the family kept their voices measured. Law enforcement officials described motive in abstract terms. Internal discipline, risk management. A decision by leadership that a noisy chapter needed to end. There were no immediate arrests. In that era, cases like this rarely produced fast answers. Funerals drew crowds. Those who came remembered different versions of the man. The loyal son who helped his mother after their father died. The teenager who ran with rough kids and kept going. The Chicago enforcer, whose cool made rooms fall silent. The Las Vegas businessman who greeted staff by name and tipped without making a show of it. The figure in court whose expression never changed while witnesses told stories that made tabloid columns buzz. His wife, Nancy, and his son faced a new quiet. Mike's family faced it too. A silence that often follows lives, lived near dangerous edges. For years, the killings remained officially unsolved, carried in folders that moved from one desk to another as personnel changed. But the story didn't stop. In 2007, a sweeping case in Chicago called Family Secrets pulled a curtain back on decades of outfit crimes. A rare insider witness, Nicholas Calabrese, testified about several old murders and described the night the brothers were called to a suburban house for a meeting. He said they were confronted by senior figures and didn't leave alive. A federal jury believed him. High-ranking men, James Marcello among them, were convicted on racketeering counts that included the brothers' deaths. The trial confirmed what many had already concluded. The organization had eliminated two of its own because leaders saw danger in letting them continue. The verdict didn't revive anyone, but it allowed the record to carry names instead of rumors. His end closed a Nevada chapter and accelerated a shift already underway. Corporate owners took full command of casinos. Regulators tightened oversight, installing procedures that had been flexible in earlier decades. Skimming on the old model became untenable. Hotel companies answered to shareholders, not quiet voices from the Midwest. Surveillance rooms upgraded. Auditors dug deep. Nevada embraced the idea that clean books were part of the show. The city still loved its secrets, but it learned to keep them in areas far from count rooms. Looking back across his life, investigators traced a line that began with street-level hustles and turned into a career built on enforcement. He was suspected in more than one Chicago killing incidents that law enforcement linked to disputes over loans, discipline, and control of earning territories. Those included the 1,962 slayings of two young men known on the street as the M&M Boys, the slaying of a businessman named Leo Foreman in the early 60s, and the 1,973 ambush of a notorious loan shark whose own career had terrorized many. In each, talk swirled. In some, he was charged and later cleared. In others, no indictment landed. Witnesses feared testifying. Cases aged into legend. Prosecutors came to court with informants and circumstantial pieces. Defense lawyers answered with attacks on credibility and reminders about the burden of proof. The man at the center took advantage of every gap. He walked out of court again and again, a pattern that built his mystique as much as any crime did. In Las Vegas, the factual record is more defined. He ran a jewelry store called Gold Rush, moved in and out of casino lounges while officially banned, pulled together a burglary ring that targeted homes and businesses by cutting through weak points, and kept a loan operation that extended credit at rates designed to keep borrowers on the hook. Police seized goods after raids. Agents mapped phone calls. Some of his crew pleaded to burglary and fence charges. He broke even with the law at times, losing associates to prison while personally beating cases. That luck contributed to resentment inside his own organization. To them, the side rackets created heat, without sending money back to Chicago in proportion to the risk. The bosses didn't appreciate a subordinate bringing TV cameras to the desert. The public knows his story in part because of film and television portrayals that drew from court transcripts and newspaper files. Those versions use fictional names and compressed timelines, yet they carried images that stuck. A small, intense man, enforcing discipline in a city of bright lights. A friendship with a casino mastermind that fell apart over personal betrayal and incompatible styles. A showdown with state regulators who refused to tolerate unofficial management. The entertainment versions made him larger than life. The official record paints him as a capable, often ruthless operator whose talent for survival met the limits of organizational patience. People who dealt with him as a customer or neighbor sometimes struggled to reconcile their experiences with the headlines. He could be courteous, even modest in casual moments. He remembered birthdays and asked about families. He showed a different face to people he considered his. Yet his working life depended on leverage. When he collected a debt, he made sure it stayed collected. When someone tried to siphon money from the skim, he was the one expected to correct the error. That duality followed him everywhere. A family man with a dangerous job, a businessman who used pressure without putting it on paper, a loyal soldier who drew too much notice in a world that punished visibility. The question of why he was removed has a short and a long answer. The short one is that he became a liability. The long one traces a decade of mounting trouble. The burglary cruise crash that produced cooperating witnesses, the public rift with the man running casino floors, the bomb that sent national news vans to a Las Vegas parking lot, the listing of his name in Nevada's Black Book, the messy personal affair, and the skimming cases that locked up bosses who no longer trusted his judgment. Leaders took all of that and made a calculation. The future required less noise. The move was brutal but consistent with their history of protecting the whole by cutting off a part. In the years after, Las Vegas evolved into a different industry. Massive resorts replaced smaller properties. Corporations reported earnings on calls that anyone could listen to. The days when a single enforcer could steer the flow of off-the-books cash ended. His name remained a shorthand for that earlier era. Tour guides still point out restaurants where he liked to sit. Old newspaper photos of him in dark suits and soft ties appear whenever the city's past comes up. The people who once looked away when he approached have long since retired. Their replacements study compliance manuals rather than street maps. Chicago, too, turned a page. The outfit shrank, adapting to a world where cameras are everywhere and juries hear wiretap audio in surround sound. Street crews moved into lower-profile rackets. Leaders discovered that the real threat to their stability wasn't a rival city but a federal government willing to build cases over years and wait for insiders to switch sides. The family secrets trial nailed down what rumors had carried for decades. It brought closure to families who had lost loved ones in earlier murders and put names next to acts that had floated in the air. It also fixed the older brother's end in history. Not a mystery anymore, but a decision made by his own colleagues. Looking back at his full record arrest without convictions, suspected roles in multiple Chicago homicides, a central presence in Las Vegas during the skim era, leadership of a high-end burglary ring, and involvement in loans and extortion, it's clear why his name fills books. He influenced the way a generation thinks about how organized crime worked in the late 20th century. Less about smoky rooms and more about practical control over systems that turned daily commerce into illicit revenue. He didn't invent those systems. He enforced them until they cracked. Family remained his soft spot. He visited his mother often, kept his brothers close, and tried to shield his son from the hardest parts of his reputation. Mike's hopes in film gave the family a glimmer of life beyond backrooms and case files. That Mike died with him made the loss heavier. Relatives still gather and talk about better days in the old neighborhood, about a father who ran a small business with pride, about Sunday meals that felt like a holiday even when money was tight. Those memories aren't erased by court transcripts. They coexist with them. He leaves behind debates that still show up in classrooms and comment sections. Was he a product of his time and place? Someone whose choices were shaped by a neighborhood that rewarded toughness? Or was he a driver who escalated risks and ignored warnings until consequences found him? The record supports both views depending on where you start the clock. What no one disputes is that he shaped Las Vegas during a critical decade, that his reach extended from pawn counters to count rooms, and that his exit marked a shift even the least romantic observers could feel. The man from the patch once stood small in a doorway and made everyone else feel smaller. In his prime, he knew how to make silence do the work of a speech. In the end, others used the same economy against him. A phone call, a meeting, a door closing facts that speak for themselves without adjectives. His name now belongs to the history of two cities, a reminder that bright lights can cast long shadows, and that power earned on the street can evaporate when the room decides it has had enough. After the funerals, people tried to sort the legend from the ledger. In living rooms and precinct offices, the question wasn't just what had happened, but how a boy from a small family shop on Chicago's northwest side had come to influence an entire era in Las Vegas. The answer, as it usually does, lived in details: the rhythm of street loans, the way a phone call could change the tone of a room, the quiet steps taken to keep cash flowing without receipts, and the patience to survive court calendars that would have crushed anyone less disciplined. He started with petty hustles, the kind kids pick up when school fades, and money becomes the measure that counts. Early arrests taught him two lessons: keep your mouth shut, and keep your circle small. Older men noticed. They trained him in the mechanics of juice loans, short-term credit, at rates that snowballed, aimed at gamblers, small contractors, and shop owners who ran out of options. A late payer got a visit before a missed payment became a story. He grew useful because he kept emotion out of it. He didn't say more than necessary, remembered everything, and never confused friendship with business once money entered the conversation. Police records from that era stacked up with his name on the edges and sometimes in the middle. The 1,962 killing of Leo Foreman stands as the first major legal collision. Foreman, a businessman with connections and a temper, ended up dead during a dispute that spilled far beyond tempers. The state built a case that included him among the enforcers. Defense lawyers picked apart inconsistencies, challenged witnesses, and reminded jurors that suspicion isn't proof. He walked. That would become a theme. Investigators suspected his involvement in other violent acts meant to keep order inside the outfit, including the slayings of two young thieves known as the M&M Boys, and the targeting of William Action Jackson after rumors of cooperation. Those suspicions lived in files and in whispers. They didn't become convictions for him. Years later, testimony in the family secrets case placed other names at some of those scenes, which only deepened the puzzle for anyone trying to draw clean lines. By the late 60s, he had a defined role in Chicago. He ran a crew, collected debts, made certain gambling operations ran smoothly, and saw to it that people who risked the outfit's business learned quickly that rules mattered. He reported up to men whose names rarely appeared in print bosses, who presided over a system that touched trucking, construction, unions, and casinos far from Illinois. When the call came to help stabilize Las Vegas, he understood the duty. He wasn't being sent on an adventure. He was being sent to protect a revenue stream that had become central to the Midwest's balance sheet. Las Vegas in 1971 offered opportunity and danger in equal measure. Properties linked to Argent Corporation created a front suitable for regulators while funneling returns to hidden partners. Count rooms fed both the books and the off-the-books packages that left town. He served as the guarantor that the latter stayed safe. He spent days in restaurants near casino floors, evenings at lounges where business could be conducted in public without sounding like business, and nights handling issues that couldn't wait until morning. When the state placed him on the excluded person list, he adjusted without blinking. He met in parking lots, drove to quiet neighborhoods, and let word travel that he was still the point of contact. The message kept earning respect from some and anxiety from others. His storefront, The Gold Rush jewelry shop provided daylight structure. To buyers, it looked like a normal retail spot. To police, it doubled as a hub where stolen items could be converted to cash and where the next job might be planned. He denied that. Associates later said otherwise in court. What can't be argued is that the shop connected him to a specialized burglary crew that learned to defeat alarms, pick entry points away from cameras, and move quickly enough to be gone before anyone understood what had happened. The nickname the city gave them, Hole in the Wall Gang, made it sound like a legend. It was a method. Find the weak spot, carve a path, take only what could be moved immediately, and leave no conversation on a phone line that could be replayed later in a courtroom. That system might have rolled on if not for a series of breaks. The 4th of July 1981 stakeout outside Bertha's Gifts and Jewelry ended with arrests and headlines. The capture of key participants undercut years of careful reputation building. Then came the bigger blow. Frank Cullotta, the boyhood friend who had stood beside him since the patch, agreed to cooperate. Under oath and in interviews, Cullotta mapped out schemes, shared rules about profit splits, and said his old friend had ordered more than one act of violence, including the killing of Jerry Lisner in 1979. Defense attorneys did what good defense attorneys do. They told jurors that Cullotta's words were a trade for leniency. They tore into his contradictions and motives. In the Lisner case, a jury returned not guilty for him in 1986. That victory didn't erase the cumulative effect of hearing, over and over, that a single man sat at the center of so many storms. While those cases heated up, the federal government stitched together its most ambitious strike at casino skimming. Wiretaps in Kansas City, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Chicago captured bosses discussing the off-the-books take in matter-of-fact language. Agents traced Teamsters loans from pension funds to casino purchases. Businessmen like Alan Glick, who had been the public face of ownership, described pressure that came with the money. The resulting strawman indictments set off trials that sent heavy names to prison. Joseph Ayupa and Jackie Cerrone in Chicago, Frank Balistrieri in Milwaukee, and Kansas City leaders connected to the Savella Circle all fell under the RICO umbrella. Although he wasn't among those convicted in strawman, the public now saw him as the desert enforcer who kept the pipeline clean. That image hardened, fair or not. Personal choices magnified risk. Frank Rosenthal, the master of casino operations who never held a formal gaming license, had once been his natural partner. Rosenthal adjusted slot holds and sportsbook lines with an unmatched eye. The man from Chicago kept outsiders in line. Then Rosenthal's marriage unraveled, and a relationship between the enforcer and Jerry Rosenthal poisoned the partnership. The fallout made quiet decisions impossible. Regulators moved against Rosenthal. A car bomb in 1982 nearly killed him. He lived and left. No court pinned that act on anyone, but the blast became a national emblem for a Las Vegas that seemed to be tearing itself apart. In back rooms far from Nevada, bosses took note. Quiet profits had become loud problems. At home, he tried to offset the public glare with family steadiness. He treated dinners like anchors, checked in on his mother when in Chicago, showed up for birthdays with neat gifts, and shielded his son from the worst of the news. He eased tension for relatives with stories about the old candy counter in the family shop and coaches who thought he could have been good at sports if life had been different. Those moments sat beside the other life. Meetings about debt schedules, phone calls about someone talking too much, conversations about whether a certain property was worth the risk. His legal record from the early 80s reads like a marathon. State burglary cases, fencing accusations, extortion counts, and a racketeering indictment circled him. He bailed out, met pretrial conditions, and kept moving. Prosecutors leaned on newly cooperative witnesses and financial charts. Defense counsel dismissed the charts as speculation and witnesses as men bargaining for their freedom. Juries split. He won some rounds, lost others by proxy when associates took pleas. Through it all, he looked like the same compact man in a well-pressed suit, unruffled in hallways outside courtrooms. Inside the outfit, patience declined. Old-school leaders blamed Vegas noise for drawing federal heat that reached into their own neighborhoods. They disliked a romance that became gossip fodder. They disliked burglary headlines that didn't feed the boss's cash drawer. They disliked television crews repeating his nickname as if it were a fact of nature. Words like clean up and tighten began to carry a different weight. He heard the warnings. He said he would pull back. He believed court wins would calm everyone. The bosses looked at the full picture. Skimming convictions up north. A blown-up car. A betrayed partner. A flipped friend. And a state that had learned how to watch count rooms. Their calculus came out harsher than his. The end in 1986 didn't come with speeches. He and his brother Mike took a routine call and did what they had always done: show up. The discovery in an Indiana field days later shocked no one inside the life and stunned everyone outside it. Official statements stayed bland. Unofficial talk settled on a simple explanation. The organization had decided that continued risk outweighed loyalty. 2 decades later, Nicholas Calabrese told a jury how the meeting unfolded and who stood where. The verdicts that followed put names to responsibility and moved the story from rumor to record. With his story closed, people in both cities tried to assess the mark he left. In Chicago, he became a case study in how enforcement held the middle of a complex structure together, and how that structure collapses when witnesses start talking and tapes replace hearsay. In Las Vegas, he symbolized a transitional era between casino bosses who traded favors in back booths and corporate executives who kept compliance charts on computer screens. The first model required a man like him. The second had no place for one. There were other strands worth understanding. His link to Herb Blitzstein showed how he delegated routine tasks while keeping final say. Blitzstein handled the books for smaller earners, tracked payments, and diffused disputes that could escalate into trouble. After the older man's death, Blitzstein remained in Las Vegas, a trace of the old network still functioning until his own slaying in 1997 shut down that chapter. The later investigation into Blitzstein's killing demonstrated how far the city had come. Cross-agency coordination, undercover work, and swift charges that stopped a power grab before it could turn into a new regime. The jewelry crew left its own mark on policing. Detectives learned to track patterns, how entry points changed, how alarm defeat techniques evolved, which items appeared repeatedly on pawn slips, and which vanished into private collections. They learned that networks like his blended legitimate shops with illegal inventory so smoothly that a quick raid rarely solved anything. You needed patience, wiretaps, and occasionally someone willing to trade secrets for safety. The Bertha's raid provided all three: people arrested on a holiday, a list of contacts, and eventually a witness who had seen the whole machine run. His nickname had a life of its own. He hated it, friends said. However, it started agents teasing him, or headline writers chasing a catchy line. It reduced a complicated man to a caricature. The real person was quieter, more watchful, more prone to let silence carry the message. He preferred a booth with a clear view of the door, not the center table. He tipped well, not ostentatiously. He listened more than he talked. He also held grudges and acted on them when business demanded. Those paired facts explain his reach better than any nickname ever could. People debate how much control he truly had. Some argue he was the indispensable link between Midwest bosses and Las Vegas realities. The man whose presence kept outsiders respectful and insiders honest. Others say he overreached, mixing sanctioned work with side rackets that brought heat without proportionate returns, setting himself up for a fall by confusing personal judgment with organizational interest. The record gives both sides material. He enforced the skim for years and kept order until corporate oversight and federal strategy shifted the ground under his feet. He also pushed boundaries, especially with the burglary crew and the personal entanglement that fractured his alliance with Rosenthal. Either way, once enough plates wobbled, someone up the chain decided to empty the table. The picture is rounded out by a look at the people who moved around him. Frank Rosenthal leveraged brains and bravado to keep casinos profitable until regulators ran out of patience. Alan Glick served as the official owner, while later describing pressure he felt to go along. Frank Collada, hardened by a lifetime in cruise, broke under the weight of possible life sentences and fear of being silenced, becoming a high-profile cooperator who lived to write about it. Midwestern bosses like Ayupa and Cerrone, who had seemed untouchable, ended up in federal custody. Each story intersected with his. Each also had its own arc that explains why the sand in Las Vegas shifted when it did. Even now, walking the strip at night, you can spot older buildings where his shadow once fell. The city sells memories with the same energy it sells shows. Guided tours mention his name as if it were part of the landscape. Longtime locals remember the feel of the town when a man in a short-sleeved dress shirt could influence decisions with a handshake in a coffee shop. Newer residents know him through movies and podcasts. The myths sometimes outpace the facts, but the core story holds. A disciplined, feared figure left Chicago to enforce a system in Nevada. He maintained it for a remarkable stretch. He mixed in side ventures that complicated everything, and he met an end decided by the very order he served. Families carry quieter versions. Nancy and their son built a life outside the noise. Brothers and cousins tell stories about holidays and small favors, about calls at odd hours checking in, about a man who, for all his sternness, melted around nieces and nephews. Those memories survive next to court transcripts and surveillance logs. They don't cancel the damage his work caused to victims of loans, extortion, and break-ins, but they remind us that lives are more than their rap sheets. Even when the rap sheet defines the public story, what his path illustrates most clearly is how time changes the rules even when the players don't. A system built on closed rooms, hand signals, and cash envelopes can function for years until audits, wiretaps, and flipped insiders erase the advantage of secrecy. He adapted as long as he could. He learned to avoid phones, turned meetings into brief walks outside, kept names off paper, and built trust at the speed of conversation. In the end, that toolkit wasn't enough. The town evolved, the law learned patience, and the organization applied its own brutal calculus. So the boy who once learned to keep his voice low ended up as one of the last unmistakable enforcers in a city that doesn't make them anymore. His life bridges eras, from neighborhood storefronts where men in short sleeves made decisions over coffee, to corporate boardrooms where compliance officers sign off on counts. The record of his crimes and suspected crimes fills shelves. The lessons drawn from them fill training binders. And the story, told and retold, still grips because it shows how a single person can become the hinge on which a chapter of two cities swings, until that hinge, too, is removed, and the door is replaced with something quieter, stronger, and built for a different age. The more people tried to diagram his life, the more they realized it resisted clean lines. In Chicago, he learned to keep accounts in his head and meetings short. In Las Vegas, he applied the same discipline to a city that was changing faster than anyone could track. Even after his death, the machinery he had managed still drew study how loans traveled, how casinos hid slices of revenue, how a storefront could anchor a network that rarely left a footprint you could photocopy. He had a knack for finding smart lawyers, and Las Vegas gave him one with a future no one predicted at the time. Oscar Goodman, a defense attorney who later became the city's mayor, stood next to him through some of his biggest fights. Goodman built cases around government overreach, unreliable informants, and the absence of direct evidence. He made jurors question why prosecutors leaned so heavily on career criminals who had cut deals. That approach played well, especially in a town suspicious of distant agents telling locals how to run their business. In hallway clips that still get replayed, Goodman would step to microphones while his client stood a step behind, expression flat, tie neat, letting the lawyer carry the volume. The federal cases built around casino skimming reached a high point with indictments that carried the strawman label. Agents in several cities put together a broad picture. Teamsters' pension money approved for casino purchases. Businessmen like Alan Glick serving as public owners. Count rooms where a portion of cash never reached the ledger. Couriers traveling to distribute the unrecorded cut among bosses in the Midwest. And enforcers ensuring no one along the route took extra. Tapes captured Midwestern figures discussing the skim in the language of business percentages, schedules, expected totals. Jurors listened to hours of audio and watched witnesses who rarely appeared in court. Convictions handed down in 1985 and 1986 sent major names to prison. Each verdict reinforced the government's claim that the old model had been mapped with clarity. Other events beyond Las Vegas influenced the atmosphere around him. In Chicago, Teamsters power broker Alan Dorfman was shot to death in 1983, a killing widely read as a signal that people who knew too much about pension loans faced the highest stakes. Around the same time, bookmaker Ken Ito, known as Tokyo Joe, survived an attempt on his life and then cooperated with authorities. His testimony opened doors the government had pushed at for years. Moves like that shook the outfit's confidence in its own secrecy. If a man with decades inside could decide that collaboration made more sense than silence, then old assumptions needed reassessment. The calculus applied to everyone, including the man stationed in the desert, Nevada's system also matured. The Black Book, which had started as a way to keep certain names off casino floors, became a symbol of the state's will to set boundaries. He was added to that list in the late 1970 seconds, and the order put every property on notice that contact with him could cost a license. Gaming regulators, people like a young Harry Reid, who served on the commission before moving on to national politics, pressed hard against unofficial influence. They understood that the city could not rise on corporate money if those companies feared reputational harm. Rosenthal's high-profile licensing battle, his late-night variety show filmed inside a casino, and the car bomb that later injured him, turned abstract concerns into household news. In that environment, the presence of a known enforcer sitting in a coffee shop carried far more risk than it had in 1971. The press found its voice too. Columnist Ned Day made a career out of exposing hidden relationships in Las Vegas. He wrote about skimming, front men, and the men behind them, and pushed readers to see past neon to the systems underneath. Day's car was torched in the late 1970 seconds. He kept writing. He died suddenly in 1987 while on vacation, a loss that became part of the city's lore. Reporters like him helped turn what had once been rumor into sustained public scrutiny. They taught locals to recognize patterns and taught viewers around the country that Las Vegas wasn't just glitter. It was governance, money flows, and, during those years, a tug of war over who controlled both. Chicago's structure loomed over everything. Tony Accardo, the legendary figure known for keeping pressure out of the headlines, had shaped the outfit's culture by insisting on profits without chaos. Under him, and later under leaders like Joseph Ayupa and Jackie Cerrone, the organization diversified and tightened. Assigning a man to Las Vegas made sense in that context. They needed someone who could ensure that decisions reached Nevada without translation errors. For a time, he did that job well. The problem wasn't a lack of nerve or a shortage of discipline. It was a convergence of forces: corporate governance, assertive regulators, long-term investigations, and personal choices that drew avoidable attention. His history in Chicago included suspected roles in internal house cleaning. The 1962 killing of Leo Foreman led to a charge and an eventual acquittal. Informants later tied his name to the elimination of the young thieves dubbed the M&M Boys, and to retaliation against William Action Jackson after accusations of cooperation. Investigators also believed he had a hand in the 1973 murder of Sam DeStefano, a loan shark whose violence made him a liability when he slipped the leash. Defense counsel countered every claim, pointing to the lack of physical evidence and reminding juries that telling a story is not the same as proving it. The result was a reputation that grew in files more than in verdicts. He became a person who could be described, but not easily convicted. Las Vegas gave him different kinds of cases. Prosecutors brought charges tied to burglary rings, fencing operations, and extortion. Search warrants at his jewelry store produced inventory lists that police argued matched items taken in sophisticated break-ins. He denied running a fence, insisted that he was a legitimate businessman, and framed the charges as guilt by association. He made bond, showed up to hearings, and kept his manner steady. Associates took pleas. He kept battling. In 1986, he won the Lisner murder case in state court, a surprising outcome given the weight prosecutors had placed on a cooperating insider's testimony. The acquittal didn't change the larger narrative. Evan Victorias felt like stopgaps. People often ask whether the affair with Rosenthal's wife was decisive. It wasn't the only factor, but it mattered. Rosenthal, a meticulous operator who knew every inch of the casino floor, had counted on a professional partnership built on trust. Once that trust broke, every disagreement became personal. The public saw two men who once presented a united front now moving in separate orbits. Bosses hated it. For them, the risk wasn't about romance. It was about predictability. If arguments leaked from business rooms into private rooms, then the chance of misunderstandings and unsanctioned moves rose, and with it, the chance that the state or the feds would find daylight to exploit. The hole-in-the-wall crew illustrated another line he crossed. The outfit wanted the skim protected and debts collected, not headlines from burglary raids that spooked property owners and sharpened police focus. He believed he could manage both, building a sideline that paid his Las Vegas network while leaving the main pipeline untouched. The Bertha's bust proved otherwise. It put named faces on the evening news and gave police leverage over smaller players who didn't share his appetite for long sentences. One by one, the dominoes tipped until the government had narratives it could test in court. Even the tools he used showed their age. Avoiding phones worked for a time, until microphones in bars and tape recorders in Midwest offices made distance meaningless. Meeting in parking lots lowered exposure, until cameras and long lenses made parking lots public. Using a retail front to anchor daytime routines helped, until search warrants and inventory audits turned daily habits into exhibits. He adjusted faster than many, but not fast enough for a world where entire cases could be built from fragments a few sentences on a recording, the timing of a flight, a ledger scribble that matched a phone call, a witness who had reached his limit. His family's story threaded through all of it. Nancy kept a home that neighbors recall as calm, even during the stormiest years. Their son grew up with a last name that drew stares, but also with parents who tried to hold normalcy in place. Brothers who lived in the old neighborhood or ventured west stayed connected to their mother and to each other. Mike, the youngest, tried to find a path in show business while helping with errands out west. The two ended together in 1986, a detail that still stings anyone who loved them. Family secrets, decades later, put the organizational stamp on what families already felt in their bones. The trial named the decision-makers and described the meeting that took the brothers off the board, giving courts what the grapevine had carried since the day the news broke. His name stayed alive in popular culture. The 1995 film that dramatized the Skim era recast him as a volatile character named Nicky Santoro, a portrait that blended documented facts with cinematic flourish. The movie preserved the broad strokes: the enforcer from Chicago, the alliance with a casino mastermind, the affair that shattered trust, the burglaries that brought heat, and an end decided by the organization he served. It also turned complexities into scenes that could be watched in 2 hours. Viewers often remember the film more than the files. Historians and reporters spend years separating the two. For law enforcement, the period became a masterclass in patience. Agents coordinated across jurisdictions, shared transcripts, and built timelines that spanned states. Prosecutors learned to explain financial crimes to juries in plain language. Detectives in Las Vegas refined methods for tracking fencing networks through pawn slips and quiet interviews. Regulators tightened processes so that count rooms and surveillance rooms spoke the same language. Each improvement made it harder for a single person, no matter how disciplined, to steer an entire system through force of personality and reputation. For people who lived under his influence, memories carry a mix of fear and respect. Small business owners who borrowed from juice lenders tell of nights when a knock at the door reset their priorities. Gamblers who needed a marker describe the quick calculation that weighed cash today against pressure tomorrow. Casino workers who watched him pass a lounge say that conversation softened, laughter dipped, and then rose again after he moved on. He didn't need to raise his voice. The room knew his role and adjusted. Even now, scholars use his career to explore how power works without official titles. He was not the boss of the outfit. He didn't own the casinos. He never held a gaming license. Yet he shaped outcomes because he could deliver consequences and carry messages from people who did hold ultimate authority. When that authority decided he had become a liability, the same lack of paperwork made replacement simple. The machine that had once relied on him moved on without having to unwind contracts or reassign badges. What remains of his record is a stack of contradictions that tell their own truth. He was a family man who brought gifts to birthdays and ran a network that frightened debtors. He denied crimes in court and watched former friends describe them under oath. He beat serious charges and lost his life to a decision rendered by colleagues. He helped keep a cash river smooth for years, and then saw the river rerouted through channels he could not access. The public remembers a nickname he disliked and a stature people mocked. The people who faced him up close remember stillness and a focus that refused to blink. As the 80s ended and the 90s opened, Las Vegas put more distance between itself and the years when someone like him could sit in a coffee shop and steer the city's shadow economy. Corporations raised towers that changed the skyline and the balance sheet. Auditors and compliance managers became as important as headliners. The town still loved spectacle, but it moved the money backstage to professionals whose reputations relied on proving that everything matched. That shift didn't erase his chapter. It set its boundaries. He was a figure of a specific moment, powerful, feared, effective in the context that created him, and finished when that context passed. The last measure of his influence might be the way both cities continue to talk about him. In Chicago, his name comes up when people explain how the outfit once managed its reach with a quiet hand and how it contracted under the weight of modern investigations. In Las Vegas, his story gets told on bus tours and in classrooms, in court training and in conversations between old-timers who still remember what it felt like when a man could enter a room and, without a word, change everyone's plans. The legend will always be louder than the ledger, but the ledger arrests, trials, bans, indictments, acquittals, and finally, a verdict delivered by his own organization remains. It is enough to understand how he rose, how he ran the years he was given, and how the cities he shaped learned to live without him. Cities remember people in layers. The first layer is headlines, the next is courtroom summaries, and beneath those are stories that move through families, told at kitchen tables long after cameras stopped caring. For him, all three layers stayed busy. Reporters still used his name to evoke a certain Las Vegas. Prosecutors still taught classes with his cases as examples, and relatives still told the softer memories that never made print. That mix is the final record. The man who enforced rules for an organization that wanted quiet profits. The defendant who stood through years of trials without raising his voice. And the brother, husband, father, and son who tried to keep a corner of his life insulated from the storm he carried everywhere else. The record begins with a neighborhood where kids learned early that attention could be either currency or danger. He chose the latter lesson and kept his circle small. He learned juice loans the way other teens learned trades, watching older men extend credit with smiles and collect with presents. Police first met him as a juvenile. By the early 60s, his name had climbed into homicide files. The 1,962 killing of Leo Foreman put him in a courtroom fighting for his freedom. He won. Investigators kept linking him, by informant talk and pattern, to other acts that maintained discipline inside the outfit. 2 young thieves taken out as a warning to others. William Action Jackson, targeted after rumors that he might have talked. Sam DeStefano, a brutal loan shark, slain in 1973 after he became a liability. None of those suspicions became a conviction for him. Some later testimony placed different men at some scenes. Yet the cloud settled. Cops wrote his name in notebooks. People on the street adjusted their behavior when he walked in. In 1971, he carried that calm menace to Nevada as Chicago's representative during the skim years. The framework was simple in concept and complicated in practice. Teamsters' pension money financed casino purchases. Public owners maintained appearances. Count rooms shaved a portion before it hit the ledger. Couriers moved the take to Midwestern cities. Enforcers kept hands honest and outsiders away. He played that last role. Nevada regulators pushed back, adding his name to the excluded person list and signaling that corporate money would get protection from shadow influence. He responded by moving conversations to coffee shops and parking lots, maintaining a schedule anyone could see but not easily record. It worked until tapes in other cities and cooperation from former allies erased the advantage of distance. His jewelry store gave him a daytime anchor. Tourists bought gifts there. Associates dropped in to check schedules. Detectives later argued that the shop funneled stolen items into the legitimate market. He denied that. What can be said without argument is that a high-end burglary crew grew around him, built on specialists who knew how to find weak points and disappear before dawn. The city named them the Hole in the Wall Gang. Their run ended on a 4th of July stakeout in 1981. Arrests followed. The illusion of invulnerability broke. Then came the turn that hurt most. Frank Colota, the friend from the patch, chose cooperation after facing the Lisner case and a future he didn't like. He told agents how the Las Vegas network worked, from split rules to stash spots. Defense lawyers worked to dismantle his credibility. In 1986, a jury acquitted the man at the center, in the Lisner killing. Even so, the effect of months of confession from a lifelong confidant could not be undone by a single verdict. While those battles unfolded, the larger war over casinos reached its apex. Operation Strawman bundled testimony from businessmen, wiretaps from the Midwest, and financial reconstructions into RICO trials that convicted major figures in Chicago, Kansas City, and Milwaukee. Jurors heard bosses talk about the skim in practical, almost dull terms, as if they were managing inventory at a warehouse. The sentences were long. The message was clear. The old arrangement could be charted, explained, and punished. Though he wasn't the one serving those terms, the enforcer's utility diminished in a city that now measured compliance with checklists. Personal choices accelerated the slide. Frank Rosenthal, the casino savant who adjusted betting lines and trained surveillance like a conductor directs an orchestra, had been a natural partner at first. The affair with Gary Rosenthal shattered that partnership. Distrust moved from private to public. Regulators denied Rosenthal a license and chased him out through administrative pressure. The 1,982 car bomb that injured him, never solved in court, pushed the story into national news cycles that wouldn't stop. Bosses watched from the Midwest and worried that the desert had turned from an asset into a risk generator. He tried to balance it with domestic normalcy. Nancy kept a steady home. Their son grew up with parents who made a point to show up for school nights, even when case files said the household should have been chaos. He visited his mother in Chicago, doted on nieces and nephews, and leaned on his brother Mike, who split his time between chasing bit parts and running errands out west. Family gatherings offered warm islands amid cold calculations. Those closest to him remember the gentle version: gifts chosen with care, small jokes told under his breath, and a habit of listening more than he spoke. The legal grind never stopped. Burglary and fencing counts, extortion allegations, and a racketeering case sat on calendars. He fought each one, usually free on bond, always composed in hallways where cameras fished for a reaction. He had good counsel. Oscar Goodman, a courtroom showman with a knack for puncturing government narratives, cast the government as overreaching and its witnesses as self-interested. Jurors listened. Some counts fell. Others stuck to associates. Through it all, he remained the figure whose presence alone shaped outcomes. Inside the outfit, equations turned cold. Older leaders, men shaped by Tony Accardo's rule that profits must come without noise, saw a pattern they didn't accept. A desert team that drew attention, a feud that spilled into gossip, a burglary crew that caused splashy headlines unrelated to the skim, and a wave of convictions up north that made every misstep more expensive. Warnings went out. He said he would tighten his footprint. The bosses chose another path. In June 1986, he and Mike answered a call to a meeting and vanished. Days later, workers found 2 bodies in an Indiana field. For years, the case sat without courtroom closure. In 2007, Family Secrets gave a jury the inside account. Convictions tied leadership to the murders. The decision had been organizational, not random. The very machine he had served had decided that the risk he represented outweighed the history he carried. What happened after says as much about both cities as anything that came before. Las Vegas leaned hard into corporate culture. New towers rose. Compliance offices grew teeth. Surveillance rooms became nerve centers with analytics, not just cameras. The state signaled that reputation mattered as much as revenue. The casino model shifted from private empires to public companies, and with that shift came audit trails that didn't leave much room for off-the-books arrangements. Chicago, under federal pressure and its own internal changes, scaled down and diversified. Street-level crews focused on quieter money. Long RICO cases taught a generation of prosecutors how to thread acts into a single narrative, and a generation of defense attorneys how to counter that braid without losing juror trust. The secondary players from his era ended with their own epilogues. Rosenthal moved to Florida and kept a low profile until his death decades later, occasionally granting interviews that defended his methods and cooled hot myths. Alan Glick, the public face of the Argent properties, eventually told his side to investigators and lived out of the glare. Frank Collada entered witness protection, later stepped back into public view as an author and tour guide who explained how the old Las Vegas operated, and died in 2020. Herb Blitzstein kept running everyday business until 1997, when a murder tied to a power grab ended his route and showed that echoes of the past still carried risk. Regulators like Harry Reid moved on to national roles, carrying lessons from a city where watching the count room had once been an art and became a science. Reporters who chronicled those years, including voices like Ned Day, left a record that students still read when they study how organized crime intersects with places hungry for growth. His nickname persisted in print despite his dislike. People who worked with him bristled when writers used it, saying it trivialized a man defined by focus and self-control. The tabloids preferred the label. It fit headlines. The cinema version cemented the public image. a volatile character with a short fuse, a knife for every problem, and a fatal flaw born of pride. The real-life version was less theatrical and more methodical, which made him more dangerous in the environments that created him. He relied on presence rather than volume, expectation rather than spectacle. If you strip away drama and leave the ledger, you see the through line. He rose because he could deliver results in a system that prized reliability, discretion, and force held in reserve. He lasted because he understood the limits of conversation and the power of a look in a booth where everyone knew who could make what happen. He fell because the environment changed, regulators matured, corporations replaced characters, agents stitched together cases across states, and the organization he served decided that he had become a liability in a world that now required invisibility of a kind no one in his position could promise. The harms his work caused are part of that ledger and deserve clear mention. Gamblers and small business owners sank under loans that could not be escaped. People suspected of disloyalty faced consequences that ended lives or futures. Burglaries stripped homes and shops, leaving victims to rebuild while trying to forget the feeling that their safe places could be entered without warning. Skimming siphoned money that should have been recorded, taxed, and used by companies for legitimate growth. Those are not abstractions. They are the quiet damage that sits behind any story like this, often minimized in the telling and maximized in private when bills come due, or doors feel less solid than they did before. At the same time, families who loved him and families of those hurt by him had to navigate a public conversation that often chose myth over nuance. A movie scene can turn a life into an image that lasts longer than documents. In his case, the image has power because it contains enough truth to be recognizable and enough fiction to be unforgettable. Historians, reporters, and former participants spend years disentangling the two. Their work leaves us with a picture that is still complicated. A disciplined operator with a long shadow, a man whose choices show both his skill and his blind spots, and a life that marks the end of one mode of Las Vegas and the recalibration of the outfit back home. Training in agencies today uses those complications as examples. New detectives learn that burglary crews evolve, and that patterns reveal themselves only when you look across months, not nights. Young prosecutors learn that jurors need clear, honest explanations of financial crime and witness motives. Regulators learn that the strongest rule is the one enforced consistently. Defense lawyers study how to challenge narratives built on cooperators without alienating jurors who want both accountability and fairness. Each lesson carries a piece of his story inside it, whether or not his name is spoken aloud. He didn't leave interviews or a memoir to defend himself. Others did the speaking agents, lawyers, witnesses, journalists, filmmakers, even tour guides. In that chorus, a few constants hold. He was careful. He inspired fear without theatrics. He kept family close. He avoided paperwork and phones. He beat serious counts more than once. He was suspected in acts that never became verdicts. He helped enforce a system that worked until it didn't. He died because the machine he ran for others decided it could not afford him anymore. Those constants sit at the core of any fair account. Walk the Strip now, and the city sells a different dream, one polished by corporate budgets and guarded by compliance teams that never sleep. Yet if you pause in certain old lounges or side streets near where smaller casinos once stood, you can almost hear the past footsteps coming before a conversation, a seat taken in a booth that someone left empty out of habit, a waiter greeting a regular who tipped well and never stayed long. That echo is his ghost, not in the supernatural sense, but as a reminder that cities carry memories inside their routines. Chicago carries him too, in the way people talk about the patch, about the years when names moved money without ever appearing on a form. The end of his story is a decision, not a mystery. The importance lies in what it tells us about how power protects itself and how eras turn. His life shows how much can be done with presence and discipline, and how quickly those advantages erode when the rules around you change faster than you do. It shows what happens when personal choices collide with institutional needs. It shows, finally, that legacies are built not just by what someone does, but by how cities choose to remember it. In that sense, he remains significant less as a legend to admire than as a case to study, a caution about the cost of building influence on fear, and the inevitability that systems built in shadows struggle once light becomes part of the design. He once walked into rooms and made talk quiet without saying a word. Now his name does the same thing in another way. It slows conversation into reflection. People ask how it all worked, why it lasted as long as it did, and why it ended the way it did. The answers are layered. Cash and control, loyalty and betrayal, old habits meeting new structures. Put together, they tell you who he was, what he did, and why two cities still can't tell their own stories without mentioning his. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Tony Spilotro here, thanking you for joining me on this journey through loyalty, ambition, and the quiet pulse of Las Vegas nights. If this story helped you unwind or drift into sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch but haven't subscribed yet, so if you enjoyed this one, your support truly helps us keep these powerful stories alive. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep.